young people. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, because it's easier than holding this. I realize that everybody wants to get at that cake over there, so I'm not really going to take all that much time. First of all, I want to say that I'm really honored to be in the presence of you young writers. You're very intelligent people. I did really read all your letters. I asked Kate to send them to me. And I was impressed not only by the writing, the style, some of the metaphors in them were really terrific, but mostly the sincerity. It made me glad I'm a writer because I get letters from kids. And do me a favor, you're going to be forced to have my book. So after you read it, will you write me some nice letters like that? Also, I was a long-term Providence resident, but we moved out to Barrington. So who was from Hamden Meadows? Do you know Lucas Johnson? You know Lucas Johnson? It's probably better you don't. He's my son. I also want to thank the Center for the book for inviting me here, and also for choosing my book, The Amazing Adventures of John Smith Jr., a.k.a. Houdini, to represent Rhode Island at the National Book Fair in Washington last fall. It was estimated that over 100,000 people passed through that exhibit. So 100,000 people saw this book. That's pretty cool, isn't it? It was also estimated, though, that about 10 people bought it. So what I'm hoping is that maybe that the image of the book got sort of subconsciously imprinted on their memory, and they're going to be walking around and say, oh, I want to buy this book by Peter Johnson. Yeah, it's tough to be a writer, as people always say, don't quit your day job, which leads me to the question, why the heck would any of us become writers? I'm going to give you a few real problems with being a writer, but I promise to tell you at some point none of those really mean anything. First of all, as a writer, take me. I sit in front of a keyboard for 3 hours a day, not knowing if anyone will read what I'm writing, much less if it will be published. So I've had a lot of success the last few years. And it's very hard to publish now unless you want to sell out. I'll give you an example. I have a young adult thriller coming out called Out of Eden in the fall. And it's a father and son kind of bonding story coming of age, but it's also about a serial murderer following a family into the New Hampshire woods. I had a lot of trouble publishing this book, going to the big houses. I published my middle grade novels with HarperCollins, which is a very prestigious place. But whenever I took it to a big publisher, they always wanted me to change the character of the serial murderer. And what do you think they wanted me to change that character to? Think about what's really hot now. Can anybody guess?
Vampire.
What about vampire? Yeah. So finally, I talked to this 30-year-old woman editor, and I said, why do you want me to turn, this great serial killer? I mean, I actually have some sections from his point of view. I said, why would you want me to turn him into a vampire? And I said, well, they're so scary. I said, well, a serial killer is a lot more frightening than a vampire. And she said, well, how can a serial killer be more frightening than a vampire? And I said, because they're real. No matter how much you write, you have to deal with comments like this. Secondly, if you do make it, and I'm not saying that I have made it, but I'm doing all right, you have to deal with reviews that can often be dumb. I had a book, What Happened, which actually won a number of awards, and I had a reviewer from Kirkus Reviews. All writers, we fear Kirkus Reviews because they're very Houdini. Kirkus Reviews actually picked Houdini as one of the best kids' books of the year. But I've been on the other end of that. For What Happened, which takes place, by the way, in the inner city in Buffalo, New York, where I grew up, this editor said, just another novel about disaffected suburban youths. Now, I wouldn't mind the criticism, but did she even read the book? I mean, it took place in the city. And you're going to find out, as a writer, you could get 15 great reviews, but you always remember the bad reviews. My wife is always astonished that I'll just beat up on myself forever, even if the person I feel who wrote it is an idiot. Houdini was honored by the Boston Authors Club last Thursday at the Boston Public Library, and I went down with my son from Hampton Meadows, who nobody knows. And we met Lois Lowry. I don't know if you know her book, The Giver. It's a pretty big book. And she told this story about how she had been really wounded, like more than 50 years ago. And as she was talking, I could relate to that. But 50 years ago, a bad criticism of some of her writing, and it still stung. It's tough. It's tough. You know, you can never really feel good about that criticism. Also, this is the last one. If you become sort of a well-known writer, you almost have to hide that fact from everybody, because you quickly realize that everyone is a writer, or has a son or daughter, or a grandchild who's a writer, and they all want you to read their works, which are works of genius, of course. And it can become very problematic. I had a friend of mine who had a 12-year-old daughter and wanted me to read her novel. And I would like to read everybody's stuff, you know, but up until this year I was working a full-time job. I'm still, you know, a dad, and I was a writer. Even if people wanted to pay me to read their stuff, I don't have the money, I don't have the time to do it. So I said to my friend, you know, I explained it to her, I really don't, but she kept pressing. And this was her 12-year-old daughter, and whom I like very much. And I said, well, okay, I said, just how long is the book? Can you tell me that? And she said, 1,200 pages. And my heart just sank, you know, because as a writer, the problem is once you open those gates, and I read her book, then somebody says, well, you read her book. And that woman doesn't really speak that much to me anymore, you know, about that. And I do feel bad about that. So nobody asked me to read their book tonight. Wait, I just want to have some cake. Except my good friend Walker. I read Walker's stuff all the time. Now, I could go on and on about all the bad things about being a writer, but I would probably get escorted off the stage for ruining the night. So what I want to do is talk about some of the good things. And just two things. First of all are those private moments you have as a writer. That has nothing to do with an audience. And I'm sure all of you who have written, all your kids, can appreciate that. And I'll say something about Houdini and how I got the idea for it to tell you. Houdini is about a kid named John Smith Jr., who his friends call Houdini because he's obsessed with the escape artist Harry Houdini. And he lives over in that Camp Street area on the east side. Normally jacket covers, the descriptions they give of books are slightly ludicrous, but I think this one is pretty good, so let me read it to give you an idea about the book. Houdini chronicles his life, because this is a novel within a novel, he's writing his own novel. Houdini chronicles his life as he and his friends start a leaf-raking business, befriend Old Man Jackson, a Vietnam War veteran with a seriously intimidating dog, and get even with the neighborhood bully Angel. But it's hard to find a way to write about his dad losing his job, or his brother Franklin, who was first reported missing in action in Iraq, and then still seems to be missing when he comes home. No matter what, Houdini and his friends rely on one another to figure out how to do the right thing. And Houdini discovers that writing and thinking about his friends and family lets him get to know them in completely new ways. Cool book, isn't it? It's not just be polite, and I'm not getting paid for this, okay? I'm just kidding. At any rate, I think this is a really good book, but I have to tell you, I didn't want to write this book. I wanted nothing to do with this book. What happened was, I had just finished a novel called Loserville, which takes place in Providence, and I was teaching. I was teaching at the time, doing committee work, working with my students, trying to edit Houdini and finish it up, coaching my son's sports, a 27-year-old and a 10-year-old, you know, so the problems are just all over the place. And I had a sabbatical coming up, and if you know what that is, you get a break from teaching. So all I really wanted to do was just for about 1 month to work out every day and take naps. You know? So my first day, I went for a long swim, came home, grabbed a book, and I said, I'm going to take a nap. And I put my head on the pillow, and I know this doesn't sound believable, but it is true. I heard this almost word for word. I changed it a little bit, obviously, when I wrote, but I heard, my name is John Smith Jr., but everyone calls me Houdini. If you can be patient, I'll explain the Houdini part, but first you should know what it's like to be named John Smith Jr. It sucks. It's like calling your dog Fido or your cat Mittens, like plain white bread dipped in skim milk, spaghetti without meatballs, or an old Ford Focus with roll-down windows and no CD player. And I laughed too, honestly. I laughed when I heard this kid's voice. I could see him walking around Camp Street, but I still said, John, I'm not telling you a story. I'm taking naps. But as the days went on, I could see him moving around the neighborhood, and then all of a sudden I saw Lucky, and I saw Jorge, his friend, and I still was not going to write this book. And then finally, Old Man Jackson appeared. You know, this one-armed black Vietnam veteran, and I'm from that era, so I knew a lot of guys, you know, like that. I worked in steel plants actually for years. And then when I saw his dog is named Da Nang, which is after a famous battle of the Vietnam War. He's a pit bull with one glass eye. And when I saw them walking around, I said, all right, let's do this. And my wife was worried about me. I became so obsessive. Because I wrote the first draft of this book in 6 weeks. Just writing. And it was an incredible experience. You know, that's what I love about writing. Nothing to do with anyone. Being surprised, all of a sudden somebody shows up, and then this happens. Now, when I finished the book, my editor and I, we spent a good year and a half editing it. I have a really great editor. But that's one of the reasons, you know. It's the surprises that you get when you're writing. I have another book coming out, middle grader, next summer called The Life and Times of Benny Alvarez. It was originally called The Life and Times of Benny Alvarez, Mr. Negativity. I love that, don't you? And they cut out the negativity. Actually, this book was originally called Houdini Weenie. But I was stuck with this book as I was writing, and I looked out my study, and there was a bird feeder out there. And just as I was looking, a hawk came out of nowhere and took a bird right off the bird feeder. Now, I grew up in the inner city in Buffalo, New York, so I was like, wow, you know, what was that about? But immediately, it became a major scene in my book, and actually ended up being a symbol in the novel that ended the novel. And that is why I write. I mean, it's just exciting. It's just, I mean, I can't really explain when it's happening. And all of you know it, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. The second thing is the public responses you get to your work, and I'm only going to tell you one. It was a one-sentence response I got from a kid at what happened. What happened was sometimes criticized by people because it was told impressionistically, and they said they thought that high school students would have trouble putting sections together. Because I got to tell you, editors, critics, everybody, they don't realize how smart you kids are. They always talk down to you. They don't know what you're capable of doing. So at any rate, one of my old students who was teaching at a school for at-risk boys, these were boys who had been in trouble a lot, but also just really bad readers. They hate reading. He had about 80 kids, and he took what happened because he liked the book. And they loved the book, and they could read it. And I got a number of responses back from these kids. But there was one who he said was the most troublesome kid in the class. And I had some of these long responses, some of what you had. This kid said something that, even though it's funny, it actually moves me today. And I asked my editor to put it on a book, on the back of the book in the second edition. He said, finally a book that doesn't suck. I just thought, like, this is why I do what I do. If that was the only kid who ever read that book, it was worth all the time that I put into it. And really, I was actually going to read from some of yours, but you know, Phoebe did such a great job of doing it. I was really moved at times by the things that each one of you wrote. But also what moved me were the metaphors that were created. You know, like I remember the one you were talking about, being in the boat. It was like middle school. It goes to show what you can do, you know, that we still can compete with all the visual media, with all the electronics, which unlike other writers, I don't have anything against. You know, that's all here. It's not going anywhere. So the way I feel is, don't run away from it. Just make sure there's good stuff going in. And I'll leave you with this, what I tell my students at Providence College, because they, you know, they're always saying, you know, they want to be famous. That's why everybody wants to write. You know, when I told you about people asking me to read their work, I guarantee you 99% of them have never read a word that I've written. They really haven't. All they want is they want an agent and a publisher, as if I can make that happen. They don't want to do that sort of painful stuff we all have to go through as writers, and being rejected. And I tell my students that, you know, being a writer, if you think about it, it's like being a plumber. You know, if you're a plumber, you know that you're going to end up with bad knees. So if you're going to be a writer, you're going to get kicked around a lot. And it's just the way it goes. If you want to be loved, don't be a writer. Go to your mom or dad and tell them, say, Mom and Dad, just tell me you love me. But once you put yourself out there publicly, you're going to get pounded. So what do you do with that? Well, you know what? It really doesn't matter. Because all of you guys who are writers, it really doesn't matter what the problems are. You're always going to write. Because if you're a writer, that's what you do. So, thank you.